by human beings since the dawn of time. Early man's diet undoubtedly included cannabis, since it grew prolifically in Africa and Asia and was highly nourishing due to its protein and omega-3 content. Marijuana may well have been the first cultivated plant. There's speculation that Stone Age man may have used the wild herb to speed up his language skills. The use of new tools, new materials, cave art, and musical instruments. What created this sudden improvement? Some scientists propose that marijuana could have opened the door to greater consciousness in Mesolithic man. New research suggests that the early humans who regularly consumed cannabis may have enhanced their brain functions and might have possibly triggered a great leap forward. But that's all conjecture. What we do know is that cannabis is still inspiring new discoveries and a deeper understanding of the nature of health and disease.
This group of chemicals has significant anti-tumor properties.
Cannabis kills cancer cells in many cases.
They have anti-tumor effects.
There's nothing else that impacts on so many of our illnesses.
We know that it kills cancer cells without hurting the non-transformed cells.
In recent years, the hemp plant has been proven to be anti-inflammatory, antispasmodic, and antibacterial. It can treat depression, traumatic stress syndrome, chronic pain, glaucoma, migraines, multiple sclerosis, Tourette's, nausea, and a host of other ailments without the unwanted side effects of pharmaceutical drugs. Historical evidence shows that the holy anointing oil used by Old Testament Hebrews contained cannabis extract. The early Christians used cannabis as part of their baptismal process. In the 1800s, medical journals published more than 100 articles on the therapeutic use of the drug, then known as cannabis indica, or Indian hemp. Cannabis was often prescribed by doctors and was part of every medical bag right through the early part of the century. It was a popular treatment for labor pains, asthma, rheumatism, and nervous disorders. It was even given to cranky babies to get them to stop crying. Queen Victoria, who lent her name to the repressive Victorian era, was also a bit of a pothead. The Queen found that cannabis was the only remedy that helped her painful menstrual cramps. Britannia could rule the waves a lot easier when she was high. But then the dark days for pot began in the early part of the 20th century, with the advent of chemically created drugs and an emerging profit-driven assembly line medical system. The new order didn't want competition, and cannabis was still preferred by many patients and doctors to the new miracle drugs, which were composed mainly of unnatural toxic substances. After lobbying by the pharmaceutical industry and fear-mongering misinformation by their donation-dependent allies in Congress, a federal law was passed in 1937 that prohibited doctors from prescribing pot in any circumstances under threat of prosecution, even though it was strongly opposed by the American Medical Association of its day. All cannabis products were removed from the U.S. Pharmacopoeia and the National Formulary by 1942. After alcohol was re-legalized, rather than go out of business, the massive bureaucracy of prohibition turned its operation to marijuana eradication.
It was Harry Anslinger, who was a racist, who was the head of the Federal Narcotics Bureau. He had been a prohibitionist, and then when prohibition ended, they gave him a new job, and he was in every president's government from Roosevelt to Kennedy. Harry Anslinger was concerned that the use of marijuana by black and Latino jazz musicians was going to lead to increased crime and increased mental illness in the United States.
The Treasury Department intends to pursue a relentless warfare against the despicable, dope-peddling vulture who preys on the weakness of his fellow man.
This war on cannabis lasted until just a few years ago, when states started passing their own medical marijuana initiatives in order to once again provide pot safely to patients. California was the first U.S. state to pass a medical marijuana law in 1996. The intent was to give relief to patients suffering from chronic pain, AIDS, cancer, and other illnesses. Since 1996, 13 other American states have passed similar compassionate use laws. 12 more have ballot measures or legislation pending. Although cannabis smoke has been shown to have precancerous effects in animal tissue, countless studies have failed to find a link between cannabis smoking and cancer, and in fact have shown that heavy marijuana users have considerably fewer cancers than the general population.
Dr. Donald Tashkin is a very good researcher at UCLA. He is a pulmonologist. His research demonstrated that the incidence of lung cancer in people who smoke cannabis was less than the incidence of lung cancer in people who smoke nothing at all.
We actually succeeded in studying about 600 lung cancer cases, about 600 head and neck cancer cases, and the bottom line is we failed to find any positive association between marijuana, even heavy marijuana use, which we define as more than 10 joint years. Even if you look at more than 60 joint years, a joint year is a joint a day times the number of joints smoked, we could not see an association. So I think it's really essentially a negative study. We failed to find any positive association with cancer.
Is it possible that the tar in smoked pot could be causing malignancies while the chemical constituents in pot are curing them at the same time? Although there's some concern that marijuana can exacerbate schizophrenia and psychosis in a few patients already suffering from these diseases, recent extensive studies in the UK have failed to support a causal relationship between marijuana and mental disorders.
Many of the people who are sort of phobic about marijuana say that it leads to schizophrenia. And I think what we really know is that's not the case, that adolescents who seem to have a bit of a thought disorder, perhaps pre-schizophrenia, find that smoking marijuana helps their thought disorder, and therefore you have more people who are schizophrenic who found that they can self-medicate with marijuana and they smoke marijuana. It's not that marijuana is causing the schizophrenia, it's that these people have discovered this as a potential therapy for their disorder.
It was only in the 1960s that fat-soluble THC was isolated from pot plants and declared the substance that got us high.
These substances in the cannabis plant which are active are kind of fatty-like, lipid-like, and they're hard to work with. So it has been very hard for chemists to get a handle on these kind of substances. Therefore, it took until 1964 for Raphael Mechoulam and his colleague Adri to discover the active compound in the cannabis plant, which they called then delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or as we know it, THC.
The compound that we isolated, 1964, tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, has been looked into in great depth. And indeed, for the next 20 years, people got to know a lot about the chemistry, a lot about the clinical effects, a lot about the biochemistry of THC. One thing was still unknown 20 years later. I'm speaking now, it's 1964 till the mid-80s. Nothing was known about the mechanism. How does THC act in the body?
Cannabis can affect memory and movement, but only temporarily. Though there have been reports of pot's negative effects on the heart and cardiovascular system, they are rare and not scientifically substantiated. Research has also shown that past claims of brain damage from cannabis fail to hold up under scientific scrutiny. All in all, cannabis is very low risk. The long history of the human use of cannabis also attests to its safety. Nearly 5,000 years without a single documented death.
A few different types of edibles right now.
You got the ice cream?
Ice creams and marijuana.
Medical marijuana dispensaries across America are now offering an impressive array of cannabis-enhanced foods, which makes it easier to over-medicate with marijuana edibles. But even so, they are never toxic or lethal, and the symptoms will disappear within a few hours.
Are made with more than indica hybrid, and those go by dosage. The green label or single strength, the red or triple.
See, when I've eaten stuff before, it just kind of make me tired.
I wonder if
These
it's
you wouldn't need that much of. It's,
You wouldn't need a whole
no,
one.
no way.
Have you tried
Yeah.
those?
I have. I had